All right. Well, it wouldn't be an all the goods trade puns were taken without me screwing up the sound, video, or sound and video. But hopefully you can all hear us now. So as I said, once again, welcome to All the Goods Trade Puns Were Taken, the show where we dissect the fortnight's trade news to pick out what could use some explanation, what's interesting, what's relevant to you, and what the three of us find funny. With us once again is our returning co-host, Anna Isaac, the trade and economics correspondent for POLITICOEurope and author of the Morning Trade UK, POLITICOs Daily Trade Brief. Anna, the Eurovision results. I know this is something you take very personally.
Yeah.
How do you feel?
We're starting with the strong stuff. All I can say is, look, it was like an outrageous Friar Tuck costume with zips. And, you know, when you go big, sometimes you still go home empty-handed. It was sad for the UK. But, you know, I live in hope that we'll rise from the embers, as the song suggested, and make the best of it next year.
Surely the 0 points is grounds for tearing up the trade continuity agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol.
I guess the protocol is quite fragile, so we shouldn't even joke about things that could tear it up right now. But yeah, I think it's I don't think it's because EU-UK relations are at a low ebb for once. I think it was just you know, there were some strong songs this year, and we didn't quite.
Sorry. Are we doing serious political analysis of Eurovision? Because I didn't sign up for this. I didn't watch it.
That's the show now.
It's my dream. No, I don't know. I think there were some good songs. There were some real bangers, weren't there? Really.
Yeah, some great songs. Speaking of great songs, Sam Lowe is with us again, the Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for European Reform and author of the Substack newsletter Most Favoured Nation.
Hello.
Sam, so I take it you don't want to spend the next hour talking exclusively about Eurovision.
Didn't watch it, so I struggle. I know.
Okay, we might have to take another technical pause while I remove Sam from this podcast and my life. Just like to apologize to all of our viewers who come here for good judgment, which we apparently can't display. But to give Sam a break, so we'll get off what you all want to hear about, Eurovision, and perhaps talk about a slightly less captivating, but nevertheless interesting and zeitgeisty issue, the Australia-UK FTA. Anna, you actually reported on the 15-year time frame, I think, well before anyone else did. Do you want to talk us through the news of the last few days and what's got everyone in a tizzy?
Yeah, absolutely. So it rests on the idea of having tariff-free, quota-free access. So this idea that as part of a UK-Australia deal, Sydney would get the possibility of having no limits on the amount of a range of agricultural products. A lot of people are talking about beef, but lamb also, to the UK. But rather than having what some people have, which is you know, a tariff rate quota, so you have up to a certain level and then tariffs might kick in, or they might kick in at a higher level, you're essentially getting something that's a bit like sort of zero rated, so there isn't a limit on what you can send, or the tariffs that would kick in once you get over a certain limit. So it would be a big sort of on paper liberalization. There's a bit of a debate about what that would mean in reality, given the other market dynamics, so the supply and demand in other countries, the prices that you can command in other countries versus the UK market, the gravity effect, where you're more likely to sell to a market closer to yourself because of things like transportation costs and business connections. But that's what it rests at. And so UK farmers are very concerned that the impact of a rush of Australian exports to the UK could undermine their business models, because Australia has a very different structure of farming. It's an economically very different country. It has different land mass. So it has upscale farming on a much, much grander scale than you see in smaller farms in the UK. So small farmers in the UK feel that they could be at threat because they simply don't have those same economies of scale. So they fear that they won't be able to compete in price terms. And so that's kind of the nub of where we're at. And you've got the politics of it as well. So on the one hand, you had some Brexiteers who still believe that aggressive market liberalisation is the way to go, that the UK can have very high quality products that won't be affected by other imports, that can still sort of retain their market share. And then you have some that are concerned that, you know, some promises were made to farmers, and they want to have a sort of a slightly more protected climate for farmers to operate in. So there's a divide with it. It's not just a straightforward Brexit Remain divide. I think that's sort of important to add a bit of nuance in there, because things can with trade get a bit Punch and Judy in that regard. It is a bit more complicated, and so we had reports of a cabinet split and how this was going to be handled. And it looks like the compromise that was landed on, to cut a long story short, is this slow phasing of tariff reduction. So the idea that steadily over time, with a long horizon, 10 to 15 years, you know, some preparations can be made so everyone can sort of like brace to deal with what would be a higher level of Australian imports. And I think sort of Sam's talked a bit about how other countries use this kind of approach. But that's the compromise that's been landed on. I don't think the issue is going to go away very quickly, given the level of feeling within the farming community and farming bodies like the National Farmers Union. So yeah, that's a quick rundown. Hopefully it wasn't too long. Sorry, guys.
No, that was great. That sets us up really nicely. Aidan, over in chat, pointing out perhaps some places where a 15-year timeline wasn't as readily available. But Sam, I want to come to you, because I think you've been all over Twitter basically telling people to calm down. And I wanted to give you a chance to explain that before people troll you.
Well, that's kind of you. I just sort of think, to generalize slightly, there's two camps, and this comes back to the Punch and Judy point. There's the why do you hate poor people having cheap food camp, and then there's the why do you hate British farmers camp. You know, and that's the two sort of extremes of the debate. And in reality, I just sort of think, guys, this doesn't matter very much. You know, with apologies to the Australian on this chat, you know, Australia is really far away. It doesn't really matter too much to the UK's economy. If we buy a bit more from there, fine. If we don't, cool. You know, I'm sort of in camp. I would do this trade agreement if I was the government, because it has some political benefits and it would be beneficial to some companies that trade with Australia. And then I wouldn't think about it too much anymore. I'd actually do it as well, because I think it could potentially come with some extra mobility arrangements and the like. But obviously, that's not as exciting as agri-food tariffs. But then I just think when you then start to actually talk about tariff reductions and impact on farmers, if you go to that side of the discussion, you go, okay, so Australia doesn't export that much meat here at the moment. Even if it increases tenfold, like one of the meat producers suggested, that's still not very much meat. And then you get to the question of, okay, so will that displace British farmers, or will it displace EU imports? And I sort of think, well, it's just as likely to displace, say, imports from Ireland as it is British production. And then will it even displace anything? Because then you get to the question of, okay, so what do British supermarkets do in practice? They like advertising that they sell British meat and British food. So that's not going to change too much. So we're probably just talking about people who wanted to buy Australian meat anyway, being able to get it maybe slightly easier. And yeah, over time, it might get slightly cheaper to bring in. Will that get passed on to consumers? Another question we don't know, because tariff reductions don't always get passed on to consumers, surprisingly. So I'm team everyone's getting a bit worked up about this when they shouldn't.
It's interesting, because I think, as with a lot of things in UK trade policy recently, and we can see this coming through in chat as well, there's this specific thing we're discussing, which I think Sam makes a reasonably strong case for saying, listen, chances are this particular FTA will not massively change anyone's life in the near future. It may in the margins. There may be some producers that are hurt by it, but this particular FTA, I think there's a reasonably strong case to say that even once it's fully phased in, may not change that much. But it does raise these kind of broader questions about the direction of both UK farming policy. The UK needs to devise and roll out a replacement for the cap, as Ronnie Mack pointed out, and no one's 1,000% sure where that will land or how that will work. The Common Agricultural Policy, which farms get subsidized, based on what, how much, to what extent is the UK government willing to use the tools at its disposal to support a small farm that is not competitive on price, for just in its natural state? And that is a question that is a huge political question, I think, into which some people are reading an answer from the way this FTA was done.
Yeah, and of course, there's farmers have been screwed over a bit recently in terms of Brexit. At the moment, for example, they're facing full third country checks on their exports to the EU, and EU exporters to the UK aren't seeing the same. Right, there's an asymmetry at the border right now, which leaves them at a slight disadvantage. You can argue they still benefit from having cheaper imports because you get cheaper inputs and the like, so it's not zero sum. But I can understand why everyone's upset about it, and I'm just a nerd saying maybe it's not such a big deal in this instance. However, I do think there is a broader question to be asked about the UK's trade policy in general and what it hopes to achieve. And this question of, does this agreement set a precedent for how you're going to approach everything else? And there I have lots of questions, because actually when we're talking about this agreement and the fact it reduces, we've been told it's going to go duty and quota free over a number of years. But are there other conditions on it? Are there safeguards in place? That's quite common. If you look at anything done with Japan, you've just got safeguards all over the place. So that's, when if there's a huge surge in imports at any moment.
Does one of you want to just briefly explain what safeguards are in a tariff context and how they tend to work?
Go for it.
No, go on, Sam. I kind of you want, and just correct me if I get it wrong, because there are safeguards and there are safeguards. So my understanding of what's the kind of safeguards that Sam is talking about, where they'd be built into an agreement as opposed to, say, like a snap trade remedies approach. Trade remedies are like trade defenses that you can bring in certain regards. So in this context, I think what Sam means by safeguards is if there is a sudden sharp influx of imports, if it's happening very rapidly and it seems to be having a severe impact on UK production, laid out in a certain, they can set out some parameters for that, then you're able to sort of go like, oh, hang on, no, we need to rethink this. Or for instance, if there was a sudden shift in standards, you could also then say, oh, hang on, we're going to have to impose some safeguards here. Is that about right? Is that?
I think that's kind of broadly the spirit of it. In practice, it's when you have a tariff schedule, you will basically, in a free trade agreement, you will basically list certain products on which you retain the right to impose a safeguard, where if suddenly there is, within, say, a year, an import surge, that either like massively more imports come in or the price massively tanks, you reserve the right to apply a tariff, even though the FTA says you shouldn't have it. So that's like the most common sort of special safeguard. So I think you were broadly right. Sam, you look like you want to jump in.
Yeah, well, so that's just, yes, one of the things that we don't know too much about right now. And actually, in fairness to the NFU, is the thing they're asking for, right? So at least that's what I've seen of Nick tweeting, insofar as they're not saying don't do any trade agreement or don't agree to any. So that we just want some safeguards. Okay, so let's discuss that. But the other thing that could apply that means that this duty and quota free arrangement is not as attractive to others in future is that there could be a lot of conditionality. If we think about the UK-EU duty and quota free relationship and the TCA, in order to achieve duty and quota free trade, the UK had to agree to non-regression, dynamic alignment, and lots of other things. Now, I'm not suggesting Australia is going to agree to anything on that level, but it might have to agree to something, especially in the non-regression space, and that there could make it less attractive to, say, the US or to Brazil in future. And then the other thing we have to discuss when talking about setting precedents is that not many countries want to go duty and quota free. So just because Australia wanted to do it and just because New Zealand wanted to do it doesn't mean that, for example, Canada will want to do it when we do the renegotiation. And there were some reports that Canada was looking at the Australian negotiations as an opportunity. But yes, they're looking at an opportunity to get slightly better access, but I don't see them fully opening up their dairy industry anytime soon, right? So in the absence of reciprocity, it's not clear that they could ask for duty and quota free from the UK, with the caveat that CPTPP makes it all very interesting.
I should say, Martin, the link to the SSM is the WTO version. There are additional safeguards in individual free trade agreements that are a little bit different. And hello, Worm. I can't even begin to pronounce your name, but hello and welcome to the show. Okay, so kind of the one thing that's made this a very one-sided or confusing discussion is that the only information we have at the moment on this deal is that it seems to be duty-free, quota-free, and that there was a fight in cabinet about it. We don't know the implications we don't know basically anything else about this deal apart from what it allegedly will do on tariffs, and that there was a fight about it in cabinet. And as Sam, you alluded to this. What might it do on services? What were the kind of things the two sides were asking for on services?
Yeah, and we know, for example, that Australia has very ambitious digital services agreements. So, for example, with Singapore, it's also got some arrangements with Hong Kong that are quite interesting on financial services. Is that going to be incorporated into the UK-Australia agreement? My assumption would actually be just because the UK seems pretty happy just to go for that sort of stuff. It doesn't seem to have too much of a problem, but it'd be nice to know, or it'd be nice to discuss it. And I think actually the point you're alluding to quite forcefully is that it would be nice if we were able to discuss actual substance because it had been published or shared with the British public, rather than leaked to specific journalists that are friendly or gotten hold of by journalists that aren't. And we could be having a much better discussion about all of this if we were given more information.
It is hard to build up an accurate picture of what's going on. And I think what's interesting is what will be even more important, I think, than any particular detail is the trust element you need to kind of make trade policy work, right? So the community consent you need to make that happen. We had something called the Trade and Agriculture Commission that was meant to help build trust specifically with the farming community when it comes to building free trade agreements and working out what's required. Now there were a complicated set of interests in that group, but there's still a sense that clearly that consultation process didn't go as smoothly as one would hope, because you wouldn't have then expected to see a reaction the way we have with the news that's been coming out about the shape of an Australia deal. And I think it's going to be really interesting. And I'm thinking back to what other countries have learned about how important it is to build community consent to get through the whole process, right? So it's not just a day one process, is it? You have negotiations, you have to get the deal, then you have to implement the deal. After you've ratified the deal, there are all these different hurdles that are really important, and you need trust if you're going to not just get community consent, but then also the next time you go back and you say, well, what does your industry want from a trade deal? Please help us so that we, tailor this to the UK economy. That's meant to be a sort of a virtuous circle. And if you break that virtuous circle, things can get quite difficult from a policy perspective. So I think that, as you would maybe expect from a country that's working out how to do this for the first time in a long time, it's pretty bumpy at the moment, I think, in terms of building trust. I think that's probably fair to say.
I like Martin's suggestion in the chat, which is the NFU's position with Canada should just be to say full liberalisation of dairy, which,
But honestly, as a trade negotiator, when you're dealing with your domestic stakeholders and they're like, what can we do to be helpful? Your answer is kind of like, during the negotiation, come out and say you have wild demands and that everything the other side is asking for will be the end of Western civilization, so that we could score some more negotiating credit. He's not wrong.
But this is one bit that is interesting, because this relates to the Australian negotiations, right? Australia did not ever think duty and quota free was possible. Let's just, Dmitry, you've negotiated with the Australians. Would they ask for it? Yes. Would they actually think it was going to happen? No.
So every negotiation, like between developed countries, begins with this like chapeau thing where we're aiming to eliminate tariffs. But the understanding is that that's got a pretty big star next to it, and you will negotiate. As an Australian negotiator, I don't know if it's that, but the scale of the knighthood whoever, the Australia chief negotiator is going to get for getting tariff-free, quota-free access into the UK, they will have to invent a new rank, just because I cannot overemphasize enough, how much focus there is from an Australian negotiating perspective on especially red meat access. We care about other things, digital services, all of that stuff, but from a kind of what are our marching orders perspective, hi, gents. That's like that is the ballgame. That is where we aim. So the fact that we're actually going to get it is, I think, blowing some minds in Canberra. And the fact that I keep kind of asking why is probably going to get me persona non grata from my own country. But I think, on this question of building trust, since the UK government is still working on that, perhaps maybe the three of us can I don't know, do them a solid and talk through some of the most common concerns that have been raised over Twitter over this deal, and maybe just talk through kind of case for and case against. So start with a fairly a really, really common one. Anna, there's been a lot of talk about climate and specifically the implications of bringing bringing goods from Australia to the UK. What's kind of your reaction to that? How valid is that a concern? What are your thoughts?
So, I think it's valid to have that concern about any good if that's something you really care about. Like that's completely fair. I think there's a couple of qualifications. Really hard to measure. It's really hard to measure if you're talking about like the shipping and freight implications, then you also probably want to have a fairly good idea of the carbon implications at home and how those might be adjusted for at home. And this takes us back to some of the conversations we've had before. Think about carbon border adjustment mechanisms and how do you work out what the true impact of a good is. But now that shipping and freight are going to be included in the UK's net zero target, those issues are going to become pretty interesting, actually. And it might be quite challenging if you were to be in a situation whereby you have tariff-free, quota-free access, but the freight calculation is so punitive for the UK market that you could find that really tricky in terms of how that was handled. Sam will have some more nuanced thoughts on this because this is his like.
My nod was me going, "That's a good point."
So yeah, but no, Sam is a specialist. But yeah, so that these are the kind of questions we're going to have to ask. I don't think we have an easy answer for it. The problem can also be that people can make different cases depending on what you mean by environmental impact. So you could have a raw carbon calculation, but that might not take into account like different aspects of animal welfare as well. So if you're thinking about the kind of scorecard you want to have for a good like that, it can be quite challenging. But it's definitely a question that we're going to sort of have to answer going forward, I think, increasingly, given the commitment to net zero and also the very obvious concerns about animal welfare that have been brought up. And we can probably touch on that in a second with Sam, maybe, or you, Dimi.
Sam, is there anything you wanted to add on that? So I had a reaction that I'm sort of, you're the expert.
Of sorts. It's just because a supplementary question to that is, okay, so if we do have a concern about the carbon intensity of certain imports, are crude tariffs the way to go about it? Right, and so is that a good justification for retaining tariffs on imports from Australia? And I'm not sure it is, because it's just very complicated. Because I'm going to just use the classic trade example of this, and I apologise for everyone that's heard it before, but you often get people say, okay, importing something from far away must be more carbon intensive than producing it at home, and you go, well, wait a second. So if we take, say, tulips from Kenya, flying them in is less carbon intensive than producing them in a greenhouse in the Netherlands, on some calculations. So it's not as clear cut as just because something's far away, it's more carbon intensive. Because also, if you're thinking about, okay, food we produced at home, where did the fertilizer come from? It's not an easy question to answer, and I'm not convinced tariffs are the right answer.
I also think there's a bit of I don't know if catch-22 is the right metaphor, but it's almost like if Australian produce starts coming into the UK as a result of this deal in volumes sufficient to make a real sort of, to not be carbon negligible, where they're not just part of a larger shipment to somewhere else or something, then chances are they're devastating UK farming at that point. And kind of this whole, there's a different issue where like either we're talking about comparatively small volumes, which is what the government is basically saying, listen, it's going to be on the margins, it's going to replace some French stuff, we're not going to see the supermarkets flooded, in which case sort of the whatever the carbon footprint of that transport is potentially bad but marginal, or it's coming in sort of carbon significant loads, at which point so much else of this debate needs to be so many of our other premises need to be rethought because things are not happening in the way we expect them to happen.
And also, we need to just remember the UK doesn't apply a carbon price to domestic agriculture production, right? So it's not like the UK is in some sort of saint here insofar as how its own production is worked through. And of course, you know, the reforming cap, and they're going to be sort of changing the basis of the payments in terms of delivery. But we still don't have a domestic carbon price for agriculture. So yeah, you could use tariffs as a proxy, but I don't know. I just sort of think, often on Twitter, my opinion, and this isn't true of everyone, some people have very deep concerns about it, but often when people bring up the what about climate change argument, it's usually just because they're looking for a reason to go, well, we shouldn't do this because I hate Brexit. That's my crude view of this.
I mean, I think there's a gentler way to put it, which is
yes.
it's okay to have it's a valid specific concern, but fighting it on this one issue rather than broadly. Like if the UK wants to chase net zero by significantly reducing shipping carbon, then that is an interesting policy.
Yeah.
Though not, but then trying to do it by very exclusively kind of keeping Australian beef tariffs high is at the same time a very loud fight that's probably comparatively little impact. But it's certainly it's a legitimate, the underlying concern is super legitimate.
Bring shipping into the UK ETS or something there's lots of more effective ways of going about this in terms of climate change mitigation.
I think it goes back to that broader issue we're talking about, where people want to feel like they're having enough of a say and their concerns are being heard and they're involved in the process. Is that I think some of the frustration that comes across, I get emails about it as well, where people feel that they want to, they feel like it's that climate change isn't being made a priority within the UK's trade policy as a whole, sometimes get snagged on these points. Mm-hmm. So I think you can definitely, I think just reiterating what you guys said, it's definitely a valid concern as a whole. It's just that taking it sort of and treating it as though you could apply it at a tariff schedule is taking probably a nut to crack a sledgehammer.
And one of the interesting things that we could see in this agreement in respect of Australia. So Australia is a developed nation that is historically quite sceptical on climate change.
Under one of our political parties.
Under one of your political parties, but does tend to go along with international initiatives would be my conclusion. Ultimately, it's signed up to Paris and the like. But it'd be intriguing to see whether, like the EU, commitment to the Paris Agreement is made an essential element of the agreement. And in EU, I'm using EU's type language here, but when you make something an essential element, it means you reserve the right to actually reject and cut and cancel the trade agreement if the other party breaches that obligation. So the EU has historically done this for human rights. In theory, it's never actually acted on any of it, but it has introduced the Paris Agreement recently as a further essential element. It'd be interesting to see how the UK brings that into the sustainable development commitments of the agreement, because if it was that clean cut, then potentially it's useful. It's I'm not saying it's going to change the world, but it would certainly be positive.
Actually, that brings us to a question I've received on Twitter a lot, and somebody suggested for this episode. I'm not even going to put it to you guys because it's so quick to deal with. How do exit clauses work in something like this? How could a future UK government get out of this deal? Obviously, we haven't seen the text, but I am willing to bet almost everything I own that it will contain an absolutely stock standard exit termination clause, or subchapter, that will basically say that if either party, Australia or the UK, wants out of the agreement, they have to notify the other party in writing, and then there is kind of a cooling off transition period, to use a now cursed phrase, of normally somewhere between 2 and 6 months, depending on the deal, at which point neither side is bound by the agreement anymore after that's over. If the UK decides to pull out, Australia can't veto their exit and vice versa. It is a completely unilateral decision. So legally speaking, getting out of a free trade agreement is easy. Or politically and economically, it's a bit more difficult, because once you have a free trade agreement, businesses start to use it. And if you pull out of it, then some of their business arrangements may no longer make sense because they were built around an absence of tariffs. Plus, it doesn't make you look great. Historically, very, very few free trade agreements in kind of the history of the world have been terminated via their exit clause. I honestly think there might be one in Latin America. I vaguely remember looking into this, but the numbers are close to zero. So legally very possible. It's not a trigger that governments have historically been eager to pull.
You've given me flashbacks to the really, really intense Twitter discussions around investment treaties, so slightly differently, and the exit clauses there, and specifically the sunset clauses in them, which would allow certain provisions to continue to apply so long as the investments were made prior to, for up to 3 or 4 or 5 years prior to the exit. But that's a slightly different issue, although I'm bringing it up now because I don't think we need to talk about it right now. But investment and investment protection is also something that's been thrown at me in relation to this agreement. It's something that hasn't been talked about, but also something that is increasingly controversial worldwide.
Actually, Zenoid's point reminds me of something else. We didn't talk about implications for Australian wine. I'm sure by now you've all seen the Sun's very edifying graphic on what the Australia-UK FTA will mean for consumers. And let me just take a pause here and speak directly to the editors of our great nation's papers. If at any point you feel the urge to do a graphic on what tariffs will mean for prices, please don't. Every UK newspaper seems to have done at least one, and they keep getting them wrong. So please don't. But on that subject, they listed the idea that Australian wine would be 20 pence a bottle cheaper. Are Australian wines likely to be 20 pence a bottle cheaper? Anna, Sam?
I think there are some supply and demand elements and some business decisions that often make it very challenging to work out whether or not some goods will be cheaper. There are some instances, and I think sometimes it's looking back at the history of trade rather than the current market dynamics. So in that regard, I do have some sympathy for it, because there have been times where in the past you've had really big market liberalizations, often involving probably just one raw commodity, where all of a sudden the price for that will have historically dropped hugely, because all of a sudden there's been a really big quantity of something. Maybe they'd had a couple of bumper seasons of a certain crop, and then at the same time you'd have had an agreement to allow more of it into a country, and then you have seen the price of some commodities really, really drop. So there have been things like that in history, or there's a big change in technology, for instance, dealing with gas extraction. Mm-hmm. So, and that has caused the price of things to suddenly drop. We know, having looked at sort of lots of recent examples, that doesn't really happen with trade, especially not with relatively open economies, relatively open advanced economies, especially like the UK. So if you're looking at what's going to change the price of Australian wine, it would be a much more valid economic analysis probably to say, well, what would be the impact of, China's response to recent tensions with Australia in terms of wine, in terms of what the price for a consumer in the UK might be, because you had a lot of production over here that was going to meet demand in one country. That demand got turned off a bit, and then there might be more supply for the UK, match up with demand, then the prices might drop a bit for UK consumers. I think taking it in isolation in that way is confusing. It can be very unhelpful for people trying to understand the trade-offs of trade, which are very complicated and sometimes really tough for some industries. And all of the government responses that putting a lot of pressure on some industries requires. So yeah, I think it is of limited value.
I just think people also, just in terms of these graphics, they do struggle to differentiate between the import cost of a product and what it gets sold for in the supermarket. which just could be completely unrelated, right? Because supermarkets have their own pricing strategies, which stuff they lose money on, which stuff they make money on, how they do it like that. And then also you just got, well, you know, if you get a cost reduction throughout your supply chain, someone throughout that supply chain might just going to pocket that, especially if they don't think, you know, the price difference is enough to actually change the consumer behavior. And then you've just got, you know, questions around how easily substitutable different products are, whether consumers are at that price sensitive or not. And it just gets you into this sort of world of pain where for each individual product, you're trying to work out sort of the elasticity of demand and substitution. And, you know, if you're doing modeling for different products, you have to do that. But if you look at the range that people even use in these models, no one actually knows. You know, it's largely just best guess. And so do I think that over time, if say Australian wine came into the UK, had the tariff reductions, it could lead to it being a couple of pence cheaper in the supermarket? Maybe, you know, maybe. But there's so many other things to consider. And Martin's brought up all of the other taxes you have to take into account, you know, excise duty, which is much bigger as a proportion of cost, and what happens there. And then you've got exchange rates, you know, so then you're comparing to counterfactuals. What would it have been, you know, if all else the same if the tariff had changed? And we've discussed counterfactuals on here before in the context of Brexit. You know, very difficult to experience and understand.
Okay, I think that was kind of a useful aside on wine. But I want to come back to one of these things that's been, I think, really bothering a large segment of the public, which is the animal welfare and the animal standards question. I mean, I might start with you, Anna. Kind of even to separate out those two issues. So there's been the question of, I think, hormone beef has really been a question, which is kind of somewhere on the border of health and safety and animal welfare. And then there's just the pure animal welfare of feedlot cattle and Australian cattle. So can you kind of talk us through what are the concerns?
Yeah, I can touch on a couple of them. There are lots, and some of them are quite complicated. So in terms of hormone treated beef, Liz Truss has been quite clear on that. She said it today on the record. She said that hormone injected beef will not be allowed into the UK. I understand that is the official position of the government, government-wide. Some people were a bit worried that the wording around injected was maybe a bit complicated, but because of how hormones tend to be administered to cattle, because they tend to be via an ear tag rather than necessarily sort of like injected with the syringe. But I don't think it was, for what it's worth, as far as I can establish, I don't think it's tricksy wording. I think the idea is that as far as sort of UK trade red lines go at the moment, hormone treated beef is one of them. It won't be allowed in. There are other issues that are quite tricky and a bit more complicated, because there isn't necessarily, from my perspective, asking questions, it's not always, the general line is high animal welfare standards is the line that the government tends to stick with. What some farmers are concerned about is that, what does that mean in practice? So there are some practices in Australia that you don't have in the UK. One of the clearest examples is something called mulesing, which is a treatment you do. So in Australia, they breed merino sheep because it creates very nice fleeces and nice meat. But merinos tend to be, they have lots of wrinkles in their skin, and they tend to be victims of blowflies. And so there's farmers remove some skin from the sheep in a manner that a lot of people who are experienced and learned in animal welfare believes is harmful or painful to the animal. Australian farmers in many instances believe it's much better for them because it means that they don't fall prey to blowfly, which can be very unpleasant. And this is an example that the National Farmers Union and others have cited as showing, that we're not comparing apples with apples on welfare standards. That comes with costs, that comes with other business challenges, and therefore, this is a factor about sort of having a level playing field for competition. Making sure that their welfare standards match up with Australian welfare standards, so that everyone's sort of getting a fair chance at the market. So those are a couple of examples. I should say that obviously a lot of Australian farmers have come out and said we have great welfare standards. So there are disagreements about the different standards here, but certainly there are some red lines, and then there are ones that are more hazy. I think is a good way to try and unpick it as an issue.
Sam, any?
You also see discussions around things like pesticide residue limits and the like, and and
antibiotic resistance as well.
Yeah. So and there's a lot, and my sort of general line here is that I don't think the UK is going to change any of its SPS rules in respect of imports. So it's not going to allow hormone beef. It's not going to allow, I don't know, your other classic, rhabdotamine pumped into pork, chickens washed with chlorine, and the like. And in terms of, say, pesticide residue limits, the rules remain the same. And then you always come back with the line that always comes back is, but we're not just worried about sort of the outcome, we're worried about how it was produced, which is all the things that Anna has been talking about. And the answer here is honestly, it's really difficult to deal with production methods in trade agreements. I mean, this isn't a new discussion. This is a debate that's been going on for ages. And there have been different ways of going about it. You see in, say, EU Mercosur, the fact that they have a TRQ that's open to eggs produced by hens that were treated nicely or something, sort of paraphrasing slightly. But so you can get there, but it is very tricky. So whilst I don't, and this is just one of those discussions that's going to be ongoing, and lots of people are always going to be unhappy. And it's going to be interesting to see if the UK does put in place some conditionality around production when it comes to tariff and quota-free trade. We'll see. But beyond that, I think the sort of people saying that, for example, Australia wants the UK to accept hormone-free beef, hormone-injected beef. I mean, ideally, yeah.
Yes, they do.
That would make their life easier. But the actual pertinent question is that going to be a condition of concluding a trade agreement? And I think there the answer is no. From my discussions with the Australians for years, have always suggested what they want tariff reductions, because they already run dual supply chains. They already supply markets that have these restrictions. They just want the option. They want the tariffs gone, and to be honest, they'll be happy with that. And the fact, as we discussed earlier, the fact that they might be getting duty and quota free is going to lead to open bus top parades as it is. I think they'd be pushing their luck to try and get the UK to change its sanitary and phytosanitary rules.
I think the way you guys laid that out sets up that kind of duopoly of the two issues. The first one is the UK likely, at least in this deal, but probably you have to say in just about any deal, to make commitments on changing what it considers safe. Because under trade rules, it is quite simple to ban something that you have evidence or you strongly believe is the actual product is a danger to your public or your animals or your ecosystem. The second issue is a lot of this stuff that Anna raised about how the animals are treated or raised, or different production methods that are either not allowed in the UK or not used in the UK or just not viable in the UK because the farming is different, but which effectively mean that if you use that method, you can produce a bit cheaper than if you don't.
And the problem is they get conflated, right?
Yes, so the two get constantly mixed up.
So if you think about, say, the chlorinated chicken debate, which hasn't been raised in this instance, but is one that lingers, you sort of say, ultimately, the evidence seems to suggest that actually rinsing chickens is fine for human health. We wash other things in chlorine, like lettuce and the like. So then people say, well, actually, the thing we're concerned about is what this chlorine is covering up, and the production methods that mean that you have to wash them. And I know it's not chlorine anymore; it's something else. But we have to wash them with this sort of acid at the end to get them clean. And we're worried about the production methods and the fact that all these hens are being treated really badly. And you go, that's a perfectly legitimate concern. But the actual SPS justification is that
is somehow bad.
Is a risk to human health.
Yeah.
And it's, I don't know. I've got no solution here, right? Because no one's managed to find one, except that you can just get away with banning things and tell people to come at you. Well, that's been the EU's approach. And we're just not quite sure if the UK is going to replicate it for the long term.
And whether it's the EU can tell people to come at it because it's quite a big entity. And it's picked some of those fights and managed to do deals like with the US, where the US came for its hormone beef ban, and the EU said, yeah, you're probably right, but we're not changing it anyway. Here's a big non-hormone beef quota to never talk to us about this again. Thanks. and they
If
did
you were
it.
the US, how tempted would you be to bring a case against the UK on all of these issues right now?
I think potentially I'd be really tempted. Because why not? What do you kind of, they're not rushing into free trade agreement negotiations anyway. The UK is far more vulnerable to US tariffs by itself than the entirety of the EU is. It's a thing to make farmers happy while they are upset at you for the trade war they will inevitably have with China. And there's just this sense of why not? There's no downside to it. The other thing for them, of course, is that they would have to take that case in the WTO, the dispute settlement of which they are currently breaking.
Well, have I ever told you my theory that chlorinated chicken will save the WTO?
You have.
Yeah.
But I guess just to kind of conclude on that last point of the difference between the two, one argument that I think the NFU would make is that retaining the ability to have tariffs lets you use those tariffs to offset these kind of advantages from production methods that other countries use. So if you can't ban battery farmed eggs, you can at least charge a tariff where the other country is then on a level playing field with you for those battery farmed eggs, with your sort of normal open free range eggs. The kind of, the slippery slope downside of that argument is that's a very convenient argument if you are a producer, and it is easy to see kind of governments get captured by that kind of rhetoric and just keep ratcheting up tariffs for all sorts of things. So this is kind of the two sides of this debate. I don't think, again, we're gonna resolve on this show in the next 11 minutes, but I think it's useful to teach the controversy anyway. And just on that sort of last thing we'll do on the Australia-UK FTA, let's maybe talk a little bit about implications for future free trade agreements. And Sam and I, you and I got into this a little bit on Twitter, but this seems to be the UK's position now. They haven't denied they're going to do this, so this has become what they're going to do. What is that likely to mean for CPTPP, for example? Sam, Anna, I don't know who wants to start us off here.
Can I go, and then I'll be brief. I'll just go CPTPP because I think I said my case on the other ones earlier. But I think it makes CPTPP accession potentially easier, in that if the UK had not committed to duty and quota free in the bilateral agreement with New Zealand, in the bilateral agreement with Australia, it is quite probable that New Zealand and Australia would have made duty and quota free access a condition of CPTPP accession. So the UK had to take a decision whether to get this over with now or return to the issue later, potentially scuppering the big prize of CPTPP. And from a strategic point of view, it makes sense to me to eat the bullet on this. That's a horrible phrase, but eat the bullet on this early, as far away from a general election as possible. So get it out the way now in the bilaterals, and it makes CPTPP accession just so much easier. Because to be honest, once you've sorted out the tariffs, everything else is actually quite easy. You just need some side letters clarifying your rules are okay and a few things. Sort out the investment stuff with the countries that care, and you're over the line. And this, look, I know everyone likes to say on Twitter, the UK doesn't have a trade strategy. If you just assume its trade strategy is we want to join CPTPP, then this just entirely makes sense.
Anna?
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. You had the choice of two fights or one, and I think by and large the feeling is to go for one. I think it will be trickier to define some boundaries in some future free trade agreements, looking beyond CPTPP, looking towards the US. I think it may make it more challenging to have some of those discussions, purely because it's about your willingness to say yes to really big asks. So like you said, in terms of Australia being, obviously they were going to ask for this, but they didn't necessarily expect to get it. I think the problem is a little bit, and it's a bit nuanced, and what will it mean for a free trade agreement? That's really difficult. Is from Sam's perspective, he's saying, well, that's not a sort of a sort of keeling over too easily, because that's about sort of the long-term approach. There's that on the one hand, and if that follows through And if CPTPP goes quite rapidly and is sort of seen as effective, I'm talking about sort of the political ramifications, the potential political ramifications here. If that works, then there's a logic that's easy to sell. It will be difficult to have made quite a big concession to Australia if, for instance, say CPTPP doesn't work out, or there's some other snag it hits, and then you're around the table again with a different trade partner that you're very eager to do business with. Are you perceived as rather than maybe literally tangibly being in a less strong position? But I don't know. I think every set of negotiations, I'm sure you agree, Dmitry and Sam, like, there are people who are learning as they do here, and they'll learn a lot more, and so they'll be more seasoned next time in a lot of cases. But I think it might be, if it doesn't go swimmingly, it's a risk strategy, I guess is what I'm saying in a nutshell. It's a risk strategy. It makes a lot of sense if what you're trying to do is smooth the course to CPTPP. And that is literally what the government has said on the record, that they see this as a deal that smooths the course to CPTPP. I think if CPTPP doesn't work out, then the potential disappointment could add to some of the negativity and the difficult questions the government has faced over this deal. And so I think it's definitely a strategy. I guess I'd say that there are balances of risks here that people are having to weigh.
So to put my kind of trade negotiators hat back on and really think through the CPTPP stuff, because I think it's fascinating, this question of, if you are in principle prepared to offer Australia duty-free, quota-free access, then when do you do it? Given that you have these two negotiations coming up, you're going to have to do the free trade agreement with Australia, and then you're going to have to do CPTPP. So the argument for doing it in the free trade agreement is, first of all, it means that your negotiations with Australia in CPTPP will likely just be a crisp round of high fives. They won't, maybe they'll push you a little bit on some stuff, but probably not too much. And secondly, and I think this is critical, if you were to offer Australia duty-free, quota-free access as part of TPP, you would have to offer it to every TPP party. And they wouldn't give you duty-free, quota-free access in return. Because the way the CPTPP negotiations work is that you negotiate with every CPTPP member, and then and then once you've reached the deal with them, they they don't average out. You have to give everyone the best of what you gave anyway. So that means potentially you would have a situation where, if they try to do it as part of CPTPP, they will have given Australia duty-free, quota-free access. They will have then automatically given everyone else in CPTPP duty-free and quota-free access, but not gotten it in return from anyone else. So there's that kind of side of it. On the other hand, doing it as part of CPTPP moves Australia from the neutral at best basket, because once Australia has its free trade agreement with the UK, having the UK as part of CPTPP is at best a neutrality for them.
Yeah.
But at worst, it's like suddenly all of these other parties, the ones that don't have FTAs as good, are going to get better access to the UK market. The CPTPP negotiations are going to be like Canada trying to improve on the CETA rollover, and Japan trying to improve on the Japanese agreement rollover. So they're like, okay, so at best they're just going to be like, yeah, okay, we won't object. But if you offer them more access as part of those negotiations, Australia then has an incentive to actively push the other parties not to be jerks and not to overreach. And so effectively you can recruit them to be in your camp within this kind of closed circle of the CPTPP membership, saying, hey guys, we really want them in the tent. Don't ask for insane things. Don't be obstructionist. Don't play games here. Let's just get this done. So that's kind of the two sides of the argument. I think the case you make for doing it now makes a ton of sense. I find it fascinating from a applied game theory trade negotiation perspective. Though I appreciate absolutely no one else does.
We do.
Oh, well, that's something. As long as I have the two of you, but you're kind of, you're trapped here, so you have to find it interesting. Okay, we have 3 minutes left, and I don't want to keep you guys over time. But perhaps then, instead of a discussion of it, Anna, you could just very briefly explain to people what is going on with this retaliation on US steel.
You want me to explain one of the biggest trade disputes of recent years in excellent 3 minutes, off we go. The UK, no longer being a member of the EU, is trying to work out how to manage its trade relationship with the US. While on the one hand, there's been lots of talk about a free trade agreement, what's kind of been less appreciated is that it has some de-escalation to do with the US, because they had two rows ongoing. So you had the Airbus-Boeing civil aircraft dispute, but you also had a dispute, people refer to it as the 232 dispute, because that's the bit of legislation that governs it in the US. But it's a tariff imposed on imports to the US from the UK, the EU, other countries, of steel and aluminium on the grounds of national security concerns. It was brought in the Trump era. And the UK, as no longer a member of the EU, is trying to have to work out how to deal with them. So which goods should it target in a way that can get the best results? So its market's a bit different to the EU's as a whole. So it's having to think about, okay, what do our consumers buy that they make in America? Because that's obviously where we want to put our tariffs, along with considering sort of political sensitivities in the US. So what the UK did today is it put out its list of goods that it's saying, okay, here are proposals of which US goods to impose retaliatory tariffs on, as you know, our best bet of saying to the US, look, this doesn't look like a great idea, does it? So how about we get around the table and we get rid of these tariffs? It comes at a really sensitive time for UK steel production already. And the list of goods are very politically sensitive. So they definitely target specific areas. So they target things like orange juice and orange juice related products. That's Florida. We've got lobsters, which are well known for being a sensitive trade issue, which targets a lot of the East Coast. And so it's interesting that this is coming out now, when hopes were meant to be fairly high for de-escalation, even if a free trade agreement looked quite far off. So it's quite hard. I'm finding it quite hard, speaking to lots of people, to quite understand exactly where we're at with the US, whether or not we're about to turn a bit of a corner, or whether or not things are actually going to stay pretty sticky in terms of transatlantic trade in the medium term.
Sam, any comment on that masterclass in concise explanation of the nightmarishly complex?
No, just that I, for one, look forward to eating more Canadian lobster.
Is that lobster that thanks you for putting it in the pot and then like apologizes for the slow cook time?
It's American lobster that gets given a Canadian flag to wave. And some of the funnier sort of ways people get around these sorts of trade restrictions.
Probably it's quite like a French scallop, right?
Yeah.
Look, if I was going to be boiled, I would want Canadian free healthcare. So I can see there's a win-win here for the lobsters too. Okay, well, time to plug your excellent works, respectively. Just one second. Our co-hosts, as always, are Anna Isaac, the UK Trade and Economics correspondent of POLITICOEurope. You can follow Anna on Twitter at Anna Isaac, and you can subscribe to Politico EU's Morning Trade UK, or bully your organization into subscribing to it. It is a fantastic blast of trade news every morning. And our own Sam Lowe, the Senior Research Fellow at the Center for European Reform, you can follow him on Twitter at Samuel Mark Lowe, and you can subscribe to his Substack newsletter for a blast of trade news in your inbox every 2 weeks. His Substack newsletter is called Most Favored Nation. And I am, of course, Dmitry Grozoubinski. I'm the director of ExplainTrade, and you can follow me on Twitter at DimitriO'Pines. So with that, thank you so much, guys, for taking time to explain some complex issues and argue about the UK-Australia Free Trade Agreement. I hope you all get to enjoy some cheaper Tim Tams, which is the underlying goal of all trade policy as far as I'm concerned, here in Tim Tam deprived Switzerland. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you in a fortnight.
See you soon.
Thanks, guys, and thanks so much to all of you for watching and for being so engaged in chat. It honestly, it makes the show. So thank